He's sucking guys. So he's just a
Hey, what's going on? We got some stories. Woke up early, bit tired. In my dream, it was a very strange dream. Woke me up early, so I check my status. I check my messages, and someone gives me some bad news. And I say, that's oddly specific bad news you're giving me. I'm sure things will work out in the end, but I just had an oddly specific dream pertaining to that bad news. So, just a little reminder, we're all connected. We're all connected, right? We're connected to each other by science on this pale blue dot, whether we like it or not. So, we have a phenomenon of teenage girls becoming political figures, and kind of wondering where this trend is going to go. I'm kind of wondering when we are going to get sex worker politicians, when we are going to get female or male sex. I mean, could be male sex worker, could be other genders too, but we could have sex worker politicians. And what's interesting about sex workers, of course, there are dominatrixes, right? There are sex workers who are paid to dominate their clients. And maybe politicians are like that in a sense. But, a lot of sex workers are paid to do things they don't necessarily want to do for the pleasure of their clients. And sometimes they are paid to degrade themselves ritualistically for the pleasure of their clients. So you look at that and you look at the sex worker, to me, is kind of the actor or actress who has been stripped of their personhood in a lot of ways, or their agency, or their that which distinguishes the human from the animal, because in sexuality there is this kind of recalling of the animal state, the animal mindset. So it's someone who sort of loses their humanity or gives that up, and then we see, of course, the modern phenomenon where there's this abstraction that becomes fetishized with the anime and the cosplay and the specificity of it all. There is an animalistic attachment to highly abstracted forms, which is kind of weird. But are we going to get to the point where we're going to have sex worker politicians? We just had in California, forget the woman's name, who pictures came out, released apparently by an ex-partner or something, of like a love triangle of sorts between herself, an intern, or a staff, or someone who worked as part of her staff, and her partner at the time. And she had, what was it? What's that German cross? I forget what it's called. The Iron Cross or whatever. She had an Iron Cross tattoo sort of in a private area, which is interesting. Democratic, bisexual, female congresswoman from California. But she didn't get into office on that premise, right? And I think we have the precedent now of sex workers becoming actresses, sex workers starting off in the porn industry and then making that transition into Hollywood. Whereas, with Harvey Weinstein, it's like, okay, you just want to be an actress, but I'm going to force you into compromising positions in order to get the job. In this case, it was like she had a successful career. Was it Sasha Grey? Is that the name? Some people have an encyclopedic knowledge of these things, but I've seen the headlines. It's kind of like I still have never understood this. Maybe it's part of the cataloging and abstraction, but it's like I don't know. How do you have that cognitive dissonance where you enjoy someone being degraded on the one hand, but on the other hand, you want to humanize them and like look up their name and learn their favorite color and this sort of thing? I don't quite understand that. But in any case, we're seeing now sex workers transition from that field into Hollywood, or next Netflix would, or whatever the transition. I don't know if Hollywood is still going to maintain the central. I know Georgia does a lot of movie work as well. A lot of movies are set in Georgia for, I guess, tax reasons. The state of Georgia is just like, oh, you want to make a movie? Here, just go at it. Whereas other states tend to have various taxes and regulations or whatever. So who knows if Hollywood, California is going to maintain its status as the epicenter of the film industry. I think New York at one point, before, I guess, the 1930s, New York City probably would have been the epicenter of American film. But we'll see. We'll see if it moves to Atlanta. Could move to Atlanta. Atlanta's a big city. But we're talking about sex workers entering into politics and the implications of that sex workers have an audience. They have an audience, mostly men, who, to various degrees, either enjoy their performance on an animal level, or they take it to the next level and they like believe these women are their friends, and they pay money to have private talks with them, and they want that intimacy, they want that personal relationship, they want that experience of the fantasy girlfriend or something. So these are the ways that men interact with sex workers, and it's like, well, why not move that to the stage of politics? And then you look at the background, it's like, why are the sex workers doing it? They're not just doing it for the approval of the fans, but they're also doing it because they're getting paid. In some cases, they're getting paid in a more decentralized way, but usually by some platform. Like OnlyFans is a platform that takes a certain cut of the deal. When you pay money to a girl on OnlyFans, it's not just the girl gets the money, but also OnlyFans gets a cut. So there's a corporate platform that monopolizes, in a sense, is the employer, is the boss. A lot of these girls think that they are self-employed, and to an extent they are, but they're really contractors on this platform. Their boss is OnlyFans. So we think about sex workers going into politics. It's kind of a reverse of the old adage about politicians sort of doing things for money, right? A lobbyist will approach them and say, hey, could you do this and that? And in exchange for some kind of financial benefit, they go along with the lobbyist. So it sort of makes sense that there would be a connection between the realm of sex work and politics in the current day, because it's about memorizing lines and putting on a performance, putting on a show, being charismatic, having a physical presence, and entertaining people, creating controversy, doing things that are controversial, breaking taboos, right? So I just feel like there's a lot of confluence between the two lines of work, and they function a very similar way, and that up front, everything's very passionate, and oh, we love what we do, and we're doing it for the people, and we just love we love everything about it. And then behind the scenes, there's a clinical element, and there's a cynical element, and there's use of drugs, and there's abuse going on behind the scenes, and there's a lot of human trafficking, both I would say in politics as well as sex work. So there's a lot of people. I was looking up R. Kelly today and his story, and he alleges that he was abused as a child by both older men and older women. And then, of course, he went on to be a celebrity, and then he was alleged to have kept women in his dungeon or something. And you look at the interview, and I guess this was a while ago, but he's very upset in this interview and very uncontrolled and not really, not like the cold, calculating Harvey Weinstein who shows up with he shows up with the walker and cane or whatever. Which, maybe his health just suddenly turned worse after these allegations came out. But very different response, making himself appear to be weak, as opposed to R. Kelly, who starts thumping his chest, jumping up, thumping his chest, giving the appearance of strength, but also of desperation. So, a different sort of presentation. Also, R. Kelly, reportedly dyslexic and illiterate, couldn't write or read. And also a professional basketball player. And apparently he's the only... I would have thought that some basketball players would have had something to do with music before. I would have thought, well, he's both a basketball player and he's a musician. I would have thought that's something that one person might have done before, but apparently R. Kelly was the first one to be both a professional musician and a professional basketball player at the same time, which is pretty incredible. He had some hits. There was a hit, I think it was called Heart of a Soldier, 2003, that came out at the height of American patriotism. And you watch the video, and it's just R. Kelly and some black churchgoers, and they're singing about the soldier and how great soldiers are in a very general way. And there's like a very kitschy American flag, like plastic platform that he's standing on, which is like, I guess, the height of patriotism in America. And R. Kelly put that on. And it was, I guess, it's supposed to be the black version of, what's that country song about America? There's a lot of country songs about America being awesome and the soldiers. Freedom isn't free or whatever. So R. Kelly did that. Interesting. It's an interesting story. But, he was a musician. All these things kind of they sort of flow together, right? People who were abused as children, people who are alleged, who are now in prison for abuse, involved in the music industry, involved in politics, involved in sex work. All these things sort of coming together. Politics as a form of entertainment. And music as a form of politics. Your musical genre that you're affiliated with defines your politics. The Juggalo movement, a very political movement in a lot of ways. So, on the nexus, the point at which all these things cross paths is interesting. And, the idea that we can have a politician or a president who is an entertainer, who is a showman, who is a TV host, essentially. Ronald Reagan before him. The idea that the president is not someone who grows up like a JFK, who grows up and goes to Harvard and does political science or history or some politics law, gets a law degree. We think of that as the traditional path for a politician, but now we're getting these sort of entertainers. And it seems like that's indicating this shift away from the politician as someone who actually makes the decisions versus someone who is merely acting as a mouthpiece, right? The reason why celebrities are so good at politics, and Brad Pitt comes out and says, whether it's on environmentalism or Trump or any other number of issues, he's going to come out and he's going to give the party line. And he's really good at that because he's an actor and he can be given lines and scripts and narratives and he can put emotion and passion into it and he can make it convincing. And he would be a great politician. Someone who's not such a great politician, Elon Musk, who has, he has a kind of weird, socially awkward charisma, but it's a charisma in spite of itself, right? So, someone who has legitimately good ideas, someone who understands the system and wants to improve it, doesn't succeed in democratic politics, which is a popularity contest. The people who succeed tend to be those who are essentially entertainers, sex workers, actors, actresses, performers, musicians. So we're seeing these entertainment politics fusing together, and so the people who are in one field fuse with another field. And we've, of course, got the rise of TikTok as a kind of decentralized beauty pageant, right? All these young people getting on TikTok and without being provided any direct, I wouldn't say it's decentralized because TikTok is a centralized platform, but whereas in the past, you have to go in the newspaper and your parents read beauty contest and they sign you up and they put you through it. The parents are kind of taken out of the equation. And so it's actually TikTok is an increase in centralization, as are many things on the internet, because it removes the intermediary of the parents. Because previously, the parents are there to make the decisions for the children. Now we're eliminating the parents from the equation and saying your child has the right to do whatever they want, and if you try to restrict their behavior, that's child abuse and we take them away. Of course, you can say, oh, that's not true. If a parent doesn't want their kids on the internet, they're not going to have their kids taken away. But I mean, we're seeing the police get more aggressive. There was a news story. Maybe I should look up AOC's Twitter because she was talking about this, but she tweets a lot. So I don't know that I'm going to be able to find AOC. I don't know if I'm going to be able to find this tweet, but maybe we should just call out the name. Oh no, AOC. There's a lot of people mentioning her. There was apparently a nurse, a young black woman nurse. She's talking about firebombing Bernie Sanders. Okay, here we go. Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor was living with her boyfriend in an apartment or a home, I forget. And the police knock on the door and say, we've got a warrant. So Breonna Taylor's boyfriend picks up his gun and he shoots through the door. So the police fire back, and apparently they end up shooting Breonna Taylor 8 times. She dies. And it turns out the warrant was for the wrong house. Of course, if the police knock on your door and they say they have a warrant and the warrant is invalid because it's the wrong house and they were looking for drugs, there were no drugs found, then you can say, oh, well, just don't shoot at the police and then you'll be fine, right? But I guess it's these kinds of brutal sort of mistakes that are just accepted as part of the system, and people on the right wing will accept it because, oh, well, it's because he's a criminal or whatever. It's his, so they'll sort of make some kind of excuse. And of course we can say, well, if you're a policeman and you're executing a warrant and you think it's for this house and you start getting shot at, then you shoot back, right? But you look at some of what's going on with the ascension of government power and the collectivization, again, the elimination of intermediaries. So this idea, and public polling is pointing toward the idea that in terms of a public crisis, the federal government should deal with it, not the states. So the popular opinion is that states should not be taking care of a crisis. It's the federal government. Again, the elimination of these intermediaries. So everything has to be really unaccountable, because if everything's concentrated in terms of federal policy, then you can't go down to the sheriff's office and elect a new sheriff or whatever. It's such a top-down system, it becomes really hard to interact with or influence the people who are making the laws and then executing them. With the FBI is potentially going to be given the authority to access people's browsing history without a warrant, which we already have the NSA, right? We have the NSA, which has been given a special legal status where they can collect all this data without needing a specific warrant. But that data is supposed to be sequestered and separate and special and locked away, and it's not something that anybody can access. So, for example, if you're a police officer and you suspect someone of cybercrime, hacking, you can't just tap into their internet history. You need a warrant to do that. And the same thing, apparently, if you're the FBI, you need a warrant for that. NSA doesn't need to, but that's specifically dealing with domestic terrorism. Now they're just saying you don't need a warrant at all. And we'll see if that bill passes. But those kinds of things, again, the intermediary of the judge, just eliminate it. Just streamline everything. Just make it so that it can just be accessed at any time for any reason or no reason at all. We just want to check in on you. We just want to see what's up. And then we can figure out everything about you. We can just collect data for no reason at all. We can just collect data in order to profile people, in order to profile political movements. Take a look at them and say, oh, okay, well, these guys are visiting all these different places, so this is where we are going to concentrate our manpower, right? These guys are visiting these websites or they're interacting with these platforms, so let's concentrate our manpower on them. We've identified them. We know who they are. We know their identity, unless you have a proxy, probably recommended at this point. If you don't have a proxy, they know who you are. They know exactly what you're doing. And so they can target their agents to address you in a way that they think will specifically be the best way to entice you into committing crimes to entrap you, right? So they could say, okay, he's this old, these are his interests, this is his personality, this is his family, this is where he comes from. So let's take an agent and model that agent's behavior and persona on this person's personality and try to entrap them, try to get them to advocate for violence. And that's going to be more effective, right? You're going to catch more people if you have access to all that information. And by catch, I mean entrap, of course. So a lot of centralization going on. Maybe we should just go into the topic here. Maybe we should jump over to the tweet of basically the concept of the tweet is here by Amy Therese. Anyone talking about establishing dual power institutions is a total crank. There's nothing stupider than pretending you can supersede globally integrated capitalist economic structures by creating local community clubs and communes. Is just absurd on its face. So, very strong position. And I'm kind of looking at, there are three possible options. The first one is a total capitulation. The home as a porn prison, estrogen for sore throats, billions infertile, rich inherit the earth. Number two is failure is possible, but death is certain. What matters is how we choose to worship and to love. And then the third would be, I don't know, some kind of third option. But that would be in between the two there. And total capitulation, I guess, I think is something that you can derive from what Amy's saying there. Of like, you can't build power from the ground up. So you kind of just have to deal with the system as it is and integrate yourself into it. And anything else is foolish. And then you've got the second one, which is saying, okay, it's foolish to try to prolong your life because you're going to die. But while we're here, we might as well make the best of it that we can. We can live out our short lives in a pitiful way, or with the short time we have on Earth, we can try to live in a way that is, deeper than just integrating with the capitalist economic structure, right? And then there's maybe some kind of third path. Maybe there's like, well, we're going to integrate a little bit, but we're also going to fight the system a little bit. And that's probably where most people are, right? Most people are like, well, we got to have jobs, and we got to be civil, and we have to go along to get along to an extent. But then secretly on the internet, we can promote what we really believe. Sort of a mix of the two. And I don't think that you can go 100% one direction or another. I don't think you can be completely opposed to the system and divested from the system, because I think at that point then you're just living in the woods and not very effective, in fact. So, in a sense, your opposition to the system has made you ineffectual, and therefore it's self-defeating. Whereas just accepting the system as it is, I don't even think that's really possible either, because, as long as you're a living human being, there are certain things you're going to want to tweak or change about the system. So that's pretty difficult as well, to just completely lose yourself and just simply become part of the system. Maybe I'm overestimating people. Maybe most people are like that. But there is a certain conflict here. There's a certain uneasiness. And that might get us into communism, praxeological defense of communism. So we know that in communism, a vast majority of the wealth is really owned by bureaucrats, right? It's not the people who own the wealth, it's the bureaucrats. We also know that in capitalism, vast majority of people are in debt and don't have any wealth at all. They have negative wealth, and most of the wealth is owned by the top 1% or less. So in that sense, in terms of wealth distribution, both communism and capitalism involve an oligarchy, where either party officials control your life and they control everything and they control you and you're a slave, or capitalism, capitalists control you, they control your life, they control everything and you're a slave. Those are the two systems, right? And of course you have middle management in both systems who have a little bit more freedom and degrees in between the spectrum, but that's the situation in both. Those are pretty harsh criticisms. And I guess the left libertarian or the anarcho-syndicalist communist will come and say, well, we don't need communist bureaucrats, and we also don't need capitalist oligarchs. We can just have worker co-ops, which I don't believe in, right? I just don't believe. I don't believe that, decentralization and power are kind of butt heads. So total decentralization basically means total abnegation of power. And that's pretty hard. I mean, you can definitely have some decentralization. Of course, we don't live in total centralization, but to have no centralization at all is pretty hard. So that's kind of what I think we're stuck with. Okay, do you want a communist system where bureaucrats control everything, or a capitalist system where supposedly entrepreneurs control everything? And this is the argument. In communism, the powerful allocate resources to themselves, whereas in capitalism, the only way to be rewarded by the market is through providing value which is in demand. The response to that is that all wealth is just insider trading, speculation. That's not a word. Speculation, monopolization. Therefore, there's no such thing as capitalism. When you look at the British East India Company, that wasn't just, a bunch of plucky entrepreneurs going off. That was the state. Those were Freemasonic, quasi-quango NGOs, quasi-NGOs. When we look at the richest people today, these are not people who have provided value the most. It's the people who have been able to best monopolize resources. Microsoft. The reason why it has so much money is because it killed the competition with lawsuits. When you take a look at Facebook, similar deal. Also funded by the government, Google, all these groups. Quasi-NGOs. So then, when you look at the way that people become wealthy, speculation, monopolization, insider trading, lawyering, abuse of law, all of these types of activities don't produce value, right? What they do is they hoard value, they move value around, they shift ownership from one person to another person. But none of these skills are really about creating value, not creating a better vehicle or creating a better quality of life or any of that. It's all about everybody earns this much money, and so we're going to sort of skim off the top with interest And if you skim 1% off everybody, all of a sudden you're the richest man on earth. So basically, capitalism is a system in which the merchant class rules. Whoever is best able to get something out of nothing rules, right? You can say, well, I have a stock. I know the stock is about to crash, like Jeff Bezos. And so I'm going to short all my stock and make a bunch of money. Now, when you short a stock with insider trading, does that mean you've contributed any value? No, it just means you had the connections, you had the clout, you had the nepotism, you had everything you needed. You already had a bunch of money, and that's how you had the resources to have the intelligence to know what was going on. Not intelligence in terms of IQ, but intelligence like FBI intelligence. You knew what was going to happen. You shorted the stock. You made a bunch of money. Everyone else is in a depression. And that's how power is distributed. And you can say, well, no. I know people in capitalism who are entrepreneurs, and that's middle management. Those aren't the people who rule. And ultimately, when you talk about middle management, they can really only work within a framework defined by the upper management, right? So then what's communism? Is communism also a merchant-led system? Perhaps in some cases. I think we can conceive of, obviously there is going to be a merchant class around. I don't think you can eliminate them. As long as you have any sort of ambiguity in life, you're always going to have somebody who can exploit that. As long as you have time preference. You know, I need $100 right now. Okay, well, I'll give you a loan with 10% interest. Even the Muslims apparently have forms of loans and interest, which are complicated financial instruments I don't understand. But apparently, even though they have laws against usury, they're able to get around that. You know, of course, medieval Europe banned usury, and they provided some extrajudicial reasoning on how to allow loans. First, it was the Knights Templar, and then other groups. So I think you're always going to have merchants as long as you have things like time preference and investment. But I think communism has a different class structure. I think communism, by its bureaucracy, the people who control the most power and the most resources aren't the people who are the best merchants. But perhaps they're the best warriors. Perhaps they get to the top because they were a general in a war. Like the Kim family in North Korea. Or Stalin was not just a bureaucrat, he was also a military general. And he was a bank robber as well early in life. He was also a priest. At one point, he was studying to become an Orthodox priest. So he had more qualities than just being a merchant. And you look at some other communist countries, Mao Zedong in China, great general. I mean, fantastic general, brilliant. And who else can we say? Even Trotsky was a general. Lenin was in some ways, a military general. And there's different incentives if you're dealing with a situation in which you're a military general, because when you're a military general, you look at the territory you control and you say, how can we make this territory as efficient as possible for the purposes of war? And that's pretty brutal, because that might mean starving the elderly, or that might mean, sending young boys off to die. War is not pretty. War is not fun. War involves a lot of physical pain and suffering and loved ones lost. But there's different incentives. So if you're a merchant-led society where you're just trying to make a buck, then the health and the well-being of people doesn't really matter. But if you're a warrior-led society, you want men to be strong, and you want productivity to be high, and you want autarky, and you want 100% employment, and you want to reduce crime, because all those things are going to inhibit your ability to wage war. Whereas if you're a merchant-led society, it's like, well, who cares? All those things are basically a Keynesian broken window, and yeah, the people themselves suffer, but we can make a buck off them. First, we can poison them, and then we can sell them the cure. A warrior-led society has no incentive to do that whatsoever. A warrior society might have a certain group of the population who is considered, as in the days of Sparta, helots. That is, this is a slave class, or the Shudra in India. These are the people, or the Dalit, I should say, not Shudra. Dalit is the correct name. This is a group of people who are like untouchable, and we don't care about them, and they're slaves, and we can treat them however we want. There might be a certain class of people who fall under that jurisdiction. But essentially, in a capitalist society, that group of helots or Dalit expands to really be the majority, where it's just like, we don't care if you overdose. We don't care if you commit suicide. We don't care what happens to you, because we're not dependent on your strength and your ability to produce and be industrious and to make war. Our power is dependent on our ability to cause problems in your life and needs and desires to induce, fantasies and fashions and obsessions and consumeristic behaviors, so that we can make money off you, so that we can sell you a brand, because the t-shirt only costs 50 cents, folks. I don't know if you know this, but a t-shirt costs 50 cents. Why you're paying $20 or $40 or more for that t-shirt, in some cases, is you're paying for the logo, you're paying for the brand, you're paying for the intellectual property, the copyright, you're paying for the enjoyment out of the content producer that is associated with that brand. You want to show your tribal loyalty because you've dedicated hundreds of hours of your life to that branding, and therefore that's the only identity that you have, really. You don't have much else going on, so why not pay $40 or $30 or $20 for a t-shirt that costs 50 cents to create? Now, of course, distribution, shipping and handling and all of that, there's obviously more money, gas money that goes into that. But certainly doesn't cost $20 for a t-shirt, but that's what people are willing to pay. Or a sweatshirt or whatever, a hoodie. Is it very cheap? The fabric is very cheap at this point. Manufactured in a factory, very cheap printing process, logos, very cheap. But that is what's being sold. So, you don't, if a worker, in a capitalist system, if a worker dies, it's like, okay, now we can sell funeral arrangements, we can sell therapy to the grieving loved ones, we can sell, drugs to the grieving loved ones. There's all kinds of broken window opportunities there for the capitalists. For the warrior-led society, it's like, we just lost a worker, we just lost a soldier, we just lost a productive unit. And neither of these societies necessarily are going to be very kind to the majority of people. Both societies are going to extract and extort resources. Both societies are effectively going to domesticate and pacify and brainwash the population. And that's just kind of unavoidable. I don't see a way out of that. You could conceive perhaps of a priest-led society that's going to try to be as kind to the people as possible. But, you could make the argument that the priest is going to be hyper-moralistic, and as a result, people are going to suffer under that kind of hyper-moralism, whatever it is. The priest only cares about God. He doesn't care anything for the individual wants and needs of the populace. So you can make a left libertarian argument there that a priest-led society is no good. Obviously, I think that priests are going to be very important in terms of, what if we just legalize murder, right? If we legalize murder, then it's a might makes right, and there's no system that can operate under might makes right. There's no system that can handle legalized murder. I think the closest you got is ancient Scandinavia. Even then, murder was still illegal. You weren't allowed to just go around randomly killing people. You could duel people, sure. You could fight for honor. You couldn't just randomly kill people for no reason at all. And if you did, there would be consequences. There would be punishments. You would be exiled. You would be blackballed. So, murder has to be illegal. We can't have a pure might makes right. And in order to make murder illegal, we have to have a consensus. In order to form consensus, we need to have means of communication and transmission of memes. Thou shalt not kill is a meme. We need to be able to transmit that. That needs to be passed on. And the way that's done is not just by a priest class, but by language in general. It just so happens that the priest class is best able to interface with memes and language. So priests can also create, hyper-moralistic cycles where it's like the important thing is, and if we could look at India maybe as an example of like cows are sacred and we've all got to be vegetarians, and, you can see the ritualization that goes on in the caste system and the stagnancy that results from that. And so, I mean, that can also be problematic. I've argued that bureaucracy is a form of a secularized priest class, which I think is what China has. And you just, compared to the West, I think you see less innovation as a result of these really priestly dominated societies. So that's not a perfect solution either. In the end, has some drawbacks. But if you're a warrior or you're an engineer, I think communism has better class incentives than capitalism. Now, of course, historically, communism was very against Christianity. And there was a huge transition communism underwent where you started with a sort of a Leninist, Trotskyist communism. Abortion made legal, divorce made legal, churches persecuted, all kinds of stuff. And that changed because the economic structure of communism benefits certain classes over others. And it just so happens that being a merchant, having that mentality, is not as effective as being of a bureaucratic mentality or being of a warrior mentality. And perhaps the bureaucrat really is some kind of fusion of the priest and the merchant. Perhaps, the bureaucrat's very materially centered, not really focused on morality. But in a way, the bureaucrat is very focused on morality, but it's a pedantic morality. It's the morality of the company or the state. The laws, Section B, Title 2 of Section B, Chapter 11, states, blah, blah, blah. And if you look at this, you know what I'm talking about. So there's a very pedantic nature to that. I think you see it in, it leans very heavily on literacy, which I think is a linguistic, getting caught up in linguistics, getting caught up in the letter of the law, as opposed to, and I guess there's a debate. I feel like the warrior class is one of the easiest to define because it's just dealing with the body and material things and just reality as it appears and strength, and like we're pretty familiar with that. And in a sense, the merchant class being money focused and money centered, we can understand that mentality. We understand what that's like. When you see your coins increasing in a video game and you keep clicking the same button, the Farmville sort of mentality, or whatever. Any of these any of these games where you're just sort of doing repetitive tasks to get more money. That's kind of a mercantile mindset it's feeding into. It's hijacking. As opposed to the warrior who's trying to break new ground, and I think is sort of a source of creativity. The priest, I think, is the most ambiguous because priests often create systems that are in opposition to one another, and you have this kind of in philosophy, it's the distinction between the continental school and the analytical school, or sometimes it's idealists versus analytic philosophy. But I think, in a sense, we can say it's those who are like the poets and the shamans, and then those who are more of the bureaucrats and the logical, atheistic, secularist, scientific. So, maybe we can say that the priest class, is kind of creating linguistic structures that are attuned to their class ecology. And so if you take a priest and you put him in a mercantile environment, well, then his linguistic structures, moralistic structures, religious structures are going to be attuned to that mercantile environment. They're going to be materialist. They're going to be bureaucratic. They're going to be scientific. Whereas if you put him in a warrior environment, he's going to be more shamanic, he's going to be more poetic, possibly. Or we could say it has something to do with the individual, but there's probably a feedback loop between the individuality of the priest and his class ecology within his own mental structure, and then also the outside society. Because people can rebel against society, but then they're also influenced by society and create a feedback loop. Let's see what Spain versus Indonesia. We have an interesting graph here, which is cool. Let's save a graph. And let's pull up a graph because we can do that. What's it going to be? Thumbnail, image, browse, downloads, and it's going to be this one here. So, I see the problem now. Haha, I see the problem. I need to do a transformation. Very cool. Very awesome. That's the letters O, not the number 0. Okay, so let's make this real big and take a look at it. Most important defining criteria of self-identification by country 2016. So we've got 5 categories: national citizenship, being a world citizen, local community, religious tradition, and race or culture. So starting with North America, we have Canada and the United States. In Canada, apparently national citizenship is much more important, or at least 6 percentage points more important, which is surprising to me. I would have thought that being a world citizen would have been much more influential in Canada, but apparently national citizenship is more important in Canada than it is in the United States. Of course, on the other hand, religious tradition is much more important, almost 3 times as important in the United States as it is in Canada. So, if we give examples, it would be a statement like, my Canadian citizenship is the most important part of my identity. And then being a world citizen is the most important part of my identity, which is just bizarre. I think that's basically a liberal ethno-religion. If you say, I'm a world citizen, well, that means you're part of like a global liberal diaspora, essentially. Local community, I don't even know what that means, but that's probably like working class people who can't deal with all these abstractions, and they just know, I got my family, I got my friends, I got my job, and that's my life, man. That's what's important to me. Religious tradition, Christianity, Islam, maybe Buddhism. Race or culture, my race is the most important part of my identity, or my culture. Not that I'm a Canadian, but that I'm Quebecois, or not that I'm American, but that I'm a Southerner. So that's the stats for North America. Then we have South America, Chile, Peru, or South and Central America. Chile at the top with 64 for the civic identity. Then world citizenry is highest in Mexico. So Mexico more liberal than Chile, which is kind of interesting given that Chile is relatively peaceful, rich, and LGBTQ friendly. Religion highest in Peru, and race or culture more important than in North America. In Russia, 70% say national citizenship, very few, 4% say world citizen, 15% say local community, 4% say religious tradition, which is interesting. So the whole concept of Christianity in Russia is actually seemingly less important than it is in Canada, if you can believe that. Russia's a more secular society than Canada. Looking at France, race or culture is very small. Religious tradition, fairly small. Smaller than Canada. Again, that's not something I would have expected for France to be less religious than Canada. The world citizen is pretty big. Scrolling down to Germany. Germany, 10% say race or culture, and I'm guessing that is corresponding with a subsection of the 20% of Germany that's not of German origin. They really identify with their race or culture. Then we look at UK. UK, by the way, UK and France are both more identifying with being a global or world citizen than Germany. So it kind of points to the idea of the Western diaspora liberalism is not felt as strongly in Germany. Germany has a more, well, they don't have a more civic identity than France, but they have a smaller correspondence of these global citizen types. It's just like, we're Germans, we follow the German bureaucracy, we let in immigrants. That's our state-given duty. Spain is very surprising here. Spain is the most liberal country in the world by the definition that I'm using, with 54% identifying as a global citizen. That's incredible when you think that Francisco Franco ruled the country in the 1970s. Like when Jimmy Carter, was it Jimmy Carter, or was it, who was before Carter? Was it Ford? I don't know if it was Gerald Ford or Jimmy Carter when Franco went out, but the 1970s, not too long ago, fascist dictatorship in Spain, and now they all believe in being world citizens. I mean, if that doesn't prove to you Amy Teresa's point about, if you just want, we're going to have a little state for ourselves in Montana. We just want to be left alone. Well, look how that worked, right? You have your own little fascist utopia, and look what happened. So that is pretty drastic for anyone who's thinking about, well, we don't need to take over the world. We just need our own little corner. It looks like you got reamed, sir. Looking over at Africa, Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria. Okay, for a comparison, Nigeria is pretty high in the race or culture component. The Igbo people of Nigeria are pretty proud and independent people. There's a lot of ethnic and tribal identification in Nigeria, as well as religious tradition. Not quite as high as America. America is still taking the cake on that one. They are more world citizens than Russia, which is interesting. And in Africa, there's a very strong civic identity, really only rivaled by, say, Russia. Very strong civic identity with citizenship, which is funny because, people always say, oh, well, the reason why Africa is so messed up is because these nation states don't correspond with people's actual identities, right? They are just arbitrarily drawn lines on the map that have nothing to do with how people actually identify. Well, you can say that, but really only Nigeria has a big tribal identification. Nigeria is one of the most successful states in Africa, next to South Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, we're speaking specifically. So this data actually indicates that the nation-state model of civic identity is the strongest part of African identity. Then over to, I guess this is Asia. So we've got China. 22% of the Chinese identify as a global citizen. I don't even know if I trust this data anymore. Who is this from? This is from, let me zoom in here. BBC. This is data from the BBC, possibly? I'm actually not sure anymore. By country, this is just random. The best kind of data. Totally random, just like made up by a dude on our data or something like that. But anyway, China, very interesting. Race or culture, 15% in China. And only 55 associate with the national identity or civic nation-state citizenship identity. Australia, huge amount of global citizenry in Australia. Very little identification with race or culture, only 2%. Shows maybe a good integration of immigrants. India, 13% association with race and culture, as well as 17 with religion. So the Hindu-Muslim distinction is pretty important. Only 6% identify as global citizens, 9% with the local community. Indonesia is very interesting because Indonesia is a series of islands, right? And because Indonesia is a series of islands, people identify basically, when you say local community, people are like, yeah, I live on this island that's like 1 out of 10,000 of islands in Indonesia, identify with that island. So they identify with their local community, they identify with their religion, with their race and culture, being a global citizen, and only 4% identify with the national government, which is very interesting as a federated series of islands. Moving on to South Korea. South Korea, 23% of people identify with race or culture, which is pretty incredible considering that there's not a lot of ethnic minorities in South Korea. So versus, we can look at Germany, where clearly there's a large immigrant population, or Mexico, where you have native peoples and you have, people descended from conquistadors and castizos. And, each of these countries, we can sort of indicate, of course, there's like vast cultural differences within these countries that would cause people to identify with their particular culture. But then you look at South Korea and they're like, I don't identify with the government or my citizenship. I identify as a Korean in an ethnic, racial sense. And it's a very... it kind of contradicts the thesis that as ethnic diversity increases, ethnic affiliation increases. Because in South Korea, there's really very little ethnic diversity, and there seems to be a lot of cultural or ethnic or racial identification. And then only, 8% identify as global citizens? Pakistan, huge religious affiliation, 43%, incredible. That's partially because the national government in Pakistan is very weak, and Pakistanis, I guess they feel kind of like their government doesn't represent them. It's very corrupt. It's very controlled by America. And so they don't trust their government. They trust religious institutions for the most part. Their government's always forcing like feminist secularism on them and, cooperation with the American government. So the global average is 52 for citizenship, 17 for global citizen, 11 for local community, 9 for religion, and 8 for race or culture. So this is a bunch of random data, totally unsourced, totally just made up. I just made it all up. That's a good one. We've almost made it an hour in, and we've discussed several different topics. So I will see you next time. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you.